Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 9. We're going to touch a little bit on Chapter 8 because we're going to be skipping over it. But I want to talk today about domestication, particularly why we have the different types of animals we have domesticated today, and why only these particular ones actually made the cut as far as what we used domestically for so many millennia. Chapter 8 summary. Basically, the idea of Chapter 8 is that the fact that we have certain areas that actually contained our fundamental crops. The crops that we use regularly today are actually found in rather specific areas. The vast majority of them would be found in the Fertile Crescent. Now, the Fertile Crescent is that area north of Israel, west of Europe, and east of Asia. It is a highly centralized area from which a lot of different plants that we use regularly today came from. These is something that we can keep in mind is why certain plants ended up in different areas and why places like Europe ended up dominating the world later as opposed to Africa or the Americas. So let's get into the chapter itself. Chapter 9, Zebras, Unhappy Marriages, and the Anna Principle. Domesticatable animals are all alike. Every undomesticated animal is undomesticatable in its own way. If you think you've already read something like that before, you're right. Just make a few changes and you have the famous first sentence of Tolstoy's great novel Anna Karenina. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The idea here, to break it down, is the fact that the animals that actually are able to be domesticated is actually pretty selective, and that you have to hit every single marker or else it doesn't work out for us. And we aren't able to use those animals for domestication. Now we're going to go over those factors a little bit later, so let's get into the other aspects and why domestication is so important. By that sentence, Tolstoy meant that in order to be happy, a marriage must succeed in many different respects: sexual attraction, agreement about money, child discipline, religion, in-laws, and other vital issues. Failure in any of these essential respects can doom a marriage, even if it has all the other ingredients needed for happiness. There are parallels with what we see in marriages, is that there are toxic parts of a relationship that if they fall within these particular areas, that they can cause the ending of a marriage, even if other aspects are perfect. It's the same thing with domestication of animals. We cannot have all but one aspect make sense or fit into the requirement, or else you're going to have a non-starter when it comes to domesticating these animals. And now this also includes more modern approaches to domestication. We tend to seek easy, single-factor explanations for success. For most important things, though, success actually requires avoiding many separate possible causes of failure. The Anna Karenina principle explains a feature of animal domestication that had a heavy consequence for human history, namely, that so seemingly suitable big, wild mammal species, such as zebras and peccaries, have never been domesticated, and that successful domesticates are almost exclusively Eurasian, having the preceding two chapters discuss why so many plant species seemingly suitable for domestications were never domesticated. We should now tackle the corresponding questions for domestic mammals. There are things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about domestication. Just because there is a possibility in our minds that we can find something that's domesticatable doesn't mean that's actually how it works out in the real world. This is something that writers tend to forget, that the difference between a possibility and reality can be a factor of minute details, but in the long run, that minute detail can change whether or not something is suitable for what we need it to do. This is something that we see not just in domestication of plants and animals, but other aspects of life. For instance, if you have somebody who is a particular disposition and they're going for a job where their particular disposition does not in line with what is required for the job, that person, regardless of how much they want that job or how much they train for that job, they will be at a severe disadvantage for that job. For instance, somebody who struggles with basic arithmetic is going to have a hard time becoming an accountant. Now, typically, when we have those type of situations, we self-select. We develop those other aspects and we find ways of making other avenues of making money for ourselves when we have those shortcomings and we become disinterested in areas where we are the weakest. In chapter 4, we remind ourselves of the many ways in which big domestic animals are crucial to those human societies possessing them. Most notably, they provided meat, milk products, fertilizer, land transport, leather, military assault vehicles, plow traction, and wool, as well as germs that killed previously unexposed peoples. There are so many factors when it comes to domestication that it's not just a single factor that ends up being a deciding factor between two peoples. But there are so many different things, and this issue that we see when it comes to domestication is that they're so multifaceted that we fail to realize of how complex why things work out the way that they do, because it is so easy for us to jump ahead to where we need to be. But as writers, we need to be careful that when we are planning out our world building, when we're planning out how things are being exposed to the plot, that it makes sense internally, because what doesn't make sense internally ends up causing fissures and cracks in our plot, where it becomes unsatisfactory with our readers in how they are interpreting the story. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense if we have a carnivoric creature that's been domesticated, as we'll go over in a little bit later, because there are factors that have to be taken in mind about how to feed a purely carnivore creature. In addition, of course, small domestic mammals and domestic birds and insects have been useful to humans. Many birds were domesticated for meat, eggs, and feathers. The chicken in China, various duck and goose species in parts of Eurasia, turkeys in Mesoamerica, guinea fowl in Africa, and the Muscovy duck in South America. Wolves were domesticated in Eurasia and North America to become our dogs, used as hunting companions, sentinels, pets, and in some societies, food. Rodents and other small mammals domesticated for food included rabbit in Europe, guinea pig in the Andes, and a giant rat in West Africa, and possibility a rodent called the huta in Caribbean islands. When we're talking about domestication, we're not just necessarily talking about the horses and dogs, but we're also talking about smaller domesticates, mammals that or fowls that are smaller that we use primarily for food or for pets. These are ways that have impacted the world. By taking in certain animals and taming them or domesticating them, we have created a society where it is a symbiotic relationship for the animals. And that if we are to remove all domesticates from our world, that there's going to be a negative effect in how our world functions. It's easy to say that it's unfair or that there are abuses that are taking place. Of course, abuse takes place. But if we are going to remove domesticates, as some people would believe we should, there are going to be some major catastrophic dangers and issues that are going to arise because of that. We have developed a symbiotic relationship with these creatures that if we were to undo that now, it will only cause pain and suffering in the long run. It's easy to come up with these solutions when everything is going well. And an idea about having a utopian world is something that is only considered when you have an excess, when you have a decreased amount of food or decreased amount of comfort. Those benefits that we are looking to do, those things that ideally would be quote unquote part of the utopia, don't make sense because we are just trying to survive. We need to be very careful when we're talking about, hey, if we do all of these things, this is how it's going to play out. We don't understand how the symbiotic nature of humans and pets actually have done significant benefit for both their groups. But if we were to wipe out all domesticates, it would cause some serious problems. If one defines big as weighing over 100 pounds, then only 14 such species were domesticated before the 20th century. Of those ancient 14, 9, the minor 9, became important livestock for people in only limited areas of the globe. The Arabian camel, the Victorian camel, llama, alpaca, distinct breeds of the same ancestral species, donkey, reindeer, water buffalo, yak, banting, growler, and gaur. Only 5 species became widespread and important around the world. Those major 5 mammal domestications are the cow, sheep, goat, pig, and horse. Now, what they're talking about here is more the fact that when we're talking about the other type of domesticates, when we're talking about cows, that's going to be different than, say, a dog. Typically, dogs come in a wide range. So, while the average is going to be, while you are going to have some species or breeds that are going to be larger than 100 pounds, say a Great Dane, a much smaller dog, such as a Dachshund, is going to be significantly less. So we cannot necessarily call that a large mammal. Even when we're talking about wolves, they're going to be much smaller than 100 pounds, depending on the subspecies of the wolf. Table 9.1. The ancient 14 species of the big herbivorous domestic mammals of the major 5. Sheep, wild ancestor, Asiatic Mafflon sheep of the West and Central Asia, now worldwide. Goat, wild ancestor, the Belzar goat of West Asia, now worldwide. Cow, alias ox or cattle, wild ancestor, the now extinct urux, formerly distributed over Eurasia and North Africa, now worldwide. Pig, wild ancestor, the wild boar, distributed over Eurasia and North Africa, now worldwide. Actually an omnivore, regularly eats both animal and plant food, whereas the other 13 ancient 14 are strictly herbivores. 5. Horse, ancestor, the now extinct wild horses of southern Russia. A different subspecies of the same species survived in the wild to modern times, such as Berzowski's horse of Mongolia, now worldwide. This list may seem at first having glaring omissions. What about the African elements with which Hannibal's armies crossed the Alps? What about the Asian elephants still being used as work animals in Southeast Asia today? No, I didn't forget them. And that raises an important distinction. Elephants have been tamed, but never domesticated. Hannibal's elephants were, and Asian work elephants are, just wild elephants that were captured and tamed. They were not bred into captivity. In contrast, a domesticated animal is defined as an animal selectively bred in captivity, and thereby modified from its wild ancestors for use by humans who control the animal's breeding and food supply. Polynesian and Aztecs developed dog breeds specifically raised for food. Comparing a Dachshund with a wolf, you wouldn't even suspect that the former had been derived from the latter if you didn't already know it. This very unequal distribution of wild ancestral species among continents became an important reason why Eurasians, rather than peoples of other continents, were the ones to end up with guns, germs, and steel. The idea here is the fact that you have an unequal distribution of these critical animals when it comes to how the people were able to domesticate them and able to use them for their own benefit. We'll talk a little bit about these factors later, but the fact is that we end up having serious issues when it comes to how widespread certain animals were when it came to their location. A lot of it were going to be located close to the Fertile Crescent, where we end up having them being able to move northwest to the Eurasians, to move around the Eurasian area so that a large portion of the world population can use it, particularly when we're talking about Europe and how Europe was able to dominate so many other continents later on. It's because they had access not only to foods that were able to be used for themselves and for their domesticates, but with the domesticates themselves, particularly when we're talking about horses. Let's define a candidate for domestication as any terrestrial herbivorous or omnivorous mammal species, one not predominantly a carnivore weighing on the average over 100 pounds or 45 kilograms. Why were Eurasia's horses domesticated but not Africa's zebras? Why Eurasia's pigs but not American peccaries or Africa's 3 species of true wild hogs? Why Eurasia's 5 species of wild cattle, uryx, water buffalo, yak, gaur, and banting, but not African buffalo or American bison? Why the Asian Melbourne sheep, ancestor of our domesticated sheep, but not North American bighorn sheep? In all of the world's 148 big wild terrestrial omnivores, mammals, candidates for domestication, only 14 passed the test. Why did the other 134 species fail? Which conditions was Francis Galton referring when he spoke of those other species as destined for perpetual wildness? The answer follows from the Anna Karenina principle. To be domesticated, a candidate wild species must possess many different characteristics. Lack of any single required domestic dooms efforts at domestication, just as it dooms the efforts of building a happy marriage. First, diet. Every time that an animal eats a plant or another animal, the conversion of food biomass into the consumer's biomass evolves and efficiency must less than 100%, typically around 10%. That is, it takes around 10,000 pounds of corn to grow a 1,000-pound cow. If instead you were to grow a 1,000 pounds carnivore, you have to feed it 10,000 pounds of herbivore grown on 100,000 pounds of corn. Even among herbivores and omnivores, species like koalas are finicky in their plant preference to recommend themselves as farm animals. This is the fatal flaw of having a carnivore as a domesticate. Yes, we could have a tamed carnivore, but typically these are cost-benefit analysis that people are going to be making subconsciously. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a food base where you have to provide a food that is so much more expensive. For instance, it's going to cost a lot more money to provide food for a single carnivore, a 1,000-pound carnivore. It's going to cost 10 times more to provide food for a single carnivore than it would be for an herbivore. Now, an exception would be is the pig. We talked about how it's a omnivore, more like us, where you can actually have them eat food scraps off of human tables, and you're actually able to get rid of the excess food that we have, and then we can use that to supplement the food that they are eating. But there are other creatures that are more omnivores that have other issues that we could use but are unable to, given the fact that they have other factors that are denying them our ability to domesticate them. Growth rate. The second one is growth rate. To be worth keeping, domesticates must also grow quickly. That eliminates gorillas and elephants, even though they are vegetarians with remarkably unfinicky food preferences and represent a lot of meat. What would be gorilla or elephant rancher would wait 15 years for his herd to reach adult size. Modern Asians who want to work elephants find it much cheaper to capture them in the wild and tame them. Again, this comes back to cost-benefit analysis when it comes to whether or not we should be domesticating these types of creatures. How long is it going to take for the creature to grow to adult size? When that time frame is shorter, that means that the cost is going to be much lower. So for instance, if we think about this another way, if it takes a single herbivore 1,000 pounds to eat food to grow, and we want to get it as fast as possible, if it only takes a year, that's 1,000 pounds. But if it takes 10 years, that's 10,000 pounds of food that we have to provide for that creature every year over the course of its lifetime. Now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when we're looking to sell off that food, because there's a lot of money and resources being poured into that creature earlier on. It means that the meat is going to be so much more expensive when you actually do sell it off. Now, the exception to this would be when they are able to graze for themselves and you actually don't need to provide food for them by growing crops and like not. So in the case of cows. But there are other factors when we're talking about bison that are able to graze for themselves and provide for themselves in a wild basis. Problems with captive breeding. We humans don't like to have sex under the watchful eyes of others. Some potentially valuable animal species don't like to either. That's what's derailed attempt to domesticate cheetahs, the swiftest of all land animals, despite our strong motivation to do so for thousands of years. One of the things that he talks about in the book is that one of the issues could be the fact that wide areas might be required for ovulation to take place. So when we have to keep cheetahs in a small area so that they aren't, so we have an area that we can actually make sure that they're secure in, that's not enough area for those female cheetahs to actually do what they need to do for their reproduction rituals that we see in different animals. A lot of them are going to require space and land to do those types of rituals. Nasty disposition. Naturally, almost any mammal species that is sufficiently large is capable of killing a human. People have been killed by pigs, horses, camels, and cattle. Nevertheless, some large animals have much nastier dispositions, are more incurably dangerous than others. Tendencies to kill humans have disqualified many otherwise seemingly ideal candidates for domestication. The big example that they use here is actually the bear. While a bear is an omnivore, one of the downsides is that despite the fact that we can give them a lot of plants and we can subsist some of their diet with meat, the problem is that when a bear gets too large, that it is a very dangerous animal to have around. There are some cultures that will keep bears around for a certain amount of time, but will end up killing them off before they become too dangerous. There are people, and it's not uncommon to see this on the internet, where people will have pet bears. But the problem is that eventually there's always going to be a higher likelihood of being killed by these supposed pets. And because we can't actually breed these tendencies out of these creatures, particularly when we're talking about not just bears, but also hippos. Hippos are completely herbivores, but the problem is that they have a nasty disposition. Hippos tend to actually have a higher kill rate than any other animal species. This is why we don't use hippos when it comes to domestication. That cost benefit analysis is out of whack because how dangerous it is to have these creatures around. Tendency to panic. Big mammalian herbivore species react to danger from predators or humans in different ways. Some species are nervous, fast, and programmed for instant flight when they perceive a threat. Other species are slower, less nervous, and seek protection in herds, stand their ground when threatened, and don't run until necessary. Most species of deer and antelope, with the conspicuous exception of reindeer, are the former type, while sheep and goats are of the latter. The idea here is the fact that you have deer and antelope, one of those ones that one could think that they are small enough we can actually use them for farms, but the problem is that they have a tendency of running away. Literally, this is where the name white-tailed deer comes from, is the fact that when a deer runs away, they flash their white tail as a warning of others to also run. This is one of the reasons why we can't use solitary type speed animals for domestication. When they are quick to run at any sense of danger, it makes it for us difficult to control them. Social structure. Almost all species of domesticated large mammals prove to be ones with whose wild ancestors share three social characteristics. They live in herds, they maintain a well-developed dominance hierarchy among herd members, and the herds occupy overlapping home ranges rather than mutually exclusive territories. That social structure is ideal for domestication because humans in effect take over the dominance hierarchy. Domestic horses of a pack line follow a human leader as they would normally follow the top-ranking female. Herds or packs of sheep, goats, cows, and ancestral dogs, or wolves, have a similar hierarchy. As young animals grow up in such a herd, they imprint on the animals that they regularly see nearby. Under wild conditions, those are members of their own species, but captive young herd animals also see humans nearby and imprint on humans as well. One of the exceptions of this would be cats. Cats are not necessarily pack animals, but because we are able to use them for hunting, we have used that hunting instinct to hunt rodents, which would therefore offer a mutual beneficial relationship. And because they are able to imprint and grow familiar with, we are able to domesticate them. So while this isn't necessarily an exception to the rule, because they do imprint, there is a kind of a give and take with certain types of animals, whereas not as strong of a herd mentality, whereas for other animals there is a stronger one. Eurasian peoples happen to inherit many more species of domestical large wild mammalian herbivores than did people of the other continents. That outcome, with all of its monumentous advantages for Eurasian societies, stemmed from three basic facts of mammalian geography, history, and biology. In the end, when we're talking about how domestication plays out, there's so many different factors. We took a look at the big factors when it comes to it, but there are other factors that are going to also play a part. For instance, the location. We couldn't take a smaller dog like a Dachshund and actually take it up north. We have selectively bred different species to be able to survive later. There are other animals that isn't as widespread that are very narrow in the area that it's working. For instance, the two animals, one of the two animals that they talk about is actually the camel. We actually can't use the camel in other places, but it is a domesticated animal that we are able to use in hot and dry environments. But we can't use that necessarily anywhere else. I couldn't bring a camel into North America and expect it to function as well as a horse would. So these are all different things we should keep in mind when we're talking about how to world build our stories to help us create more realistic stories overall. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. As always, I will link the resources I use in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.